The silk curtain moved like a slow breath and then stilled. The scent of boiled coffee and pipe tobacco hung low in the parlor, mingled with the faint metallic trace of a sealed ledger. It was July 12, 1859, in the main parlor of Rose Hill Plantation, a two-story clapboard house 3 miles from the river at Natchez, Mississippi. 12 people had been summoned to that room: the plantation owner, the wife in a print dress that had seen better summers, 2 brothers whose faces were set as if carved, the family attorney, the plantation steward, 2 overseers, a physician from town, the local preacher, a sheriff's deputy, and a single black man who had been granted permission to attend as a witness. They expected routine inventory, perhaps a clarification of titles. None of them expected a writing that would render private atrocities into public charges and force a county into a choice about law and shame. A folded page was set on the table. The attorney removed the seal and began to read. The voice at first was steady and legal. It listed heirs. It enumerated livestock and acres. It recited a formal revocation of prior instruments and affirmed the testator's competence. There was the usual clearing of historical debts, a bequest to a church, a small sum set aside for a distant cousin. The room breathed. Then the wording changed. The attorney's tone tightened. He read aloud a provision that named an act, specified a requirement, and attached the stipulation to the transfer of the Rose Hill estate should the primary heir refuse. The clause demanded a public humiliation in a manner painfully particular. When the sentence named the wife and the 6 enslaved men under the plantation's custody, the linen on the table seemed to wrinkle of its own accord. A low gasp cut through the parlor as people who had never spoken of such things found their voices small and raw. The sheriff's deputy put his hand to his mouth. The plantation steward, Jennings, palms damp against the ledger, blinked as if the letters themselves had burned him. The implication was immediate and corrosive. This was no mere bookkeeping. It was an instruction that tethered personal violence to the transfer of property and to the legacy a man would leave. The room became a court of stunned faces and slow-burning questions about law, honor, and the logic of ownership. What makes a civilized society allow private cruelties to hide behind formal words? That was the promise of the narrative that followed. There would be more than gossip. There would be petitions, depositions, a judge's bench, and a public reckoning that extended beyond Rose Hill's magnolia trees. The reading finished, paper soft in the attorney's hands. The wife, Clara Whitmore, seated in a narrow chair, looked at the page as if it were a living thing, her hands folded as if to contain them, her breath coming and going like the riverboat whistle at dusk. In less than 4 minutes, an entire household's moral geography had been rearranged. The first response was not measured. Reverend Amos Carter rose, his collar creased, his voice raw. He shouted that such instruction could not stand under God's law. Mr. Whitmore's brother Thomas barked back that private wishes belonged to families and to the dead who knew their farms and fears. The physician, Dr. Elias Monroe, pushed forward and declared the need to examine the woman's condition in private, as if medical proof could translate moral outrage into admissible evidence. Voices rolled and collided in short, jagged exchanges. "This is abominable," Reverend Carter said. "You have no right to dictate shame from your grave," Thomas snapped. "We must consider if the testator was of sound mind when he wrote this," the attorney proposed, his words clipped. Clara stood up then. Her dress rustled, the linen whispering tiny sounds that suddenly mattered. She said in a voice that trembled between exhaustion and steel, "I will not be sold as an example." The plantation steward placed his hand on the table and said quietly, "Sir, my orders are to carry out the estate as written." The sheriff's deputy looked down. The black man present, Caleb Price, who had worked Rose Hill all his life and whose own family had been fractured by sales, said nothing at first. He watched every face as if reading the weather in the room. They argued what a will could and could not command. The attorney insisted that a last will could create legal obligations, but could not lawfully mandate criminal acts or rights that violated public policy. Thomas Whitmore accused the attorney of disloyalty, for the will might be a way to humiliate a rival family member and to shore up property lines. The Reverend insisted that the moral calamity made the house unfit. Clara walked to the window and looked at the fields, the rows of cotton bending like heads in wind, and the sense of inheritance shifted beneath her feet. To understand why Rose Hill would become a subject of petitions and papers, we must go back. Clara Whitmore was not a woman born to the planter class. She had been raised in a market town, the daughter of a tavern keeper who taught her early the price of silence and the currency of a steady hand. At 17, she met James Whitmore at a dance. He had been a young overseer then, practical and lean, carrying the look of someone whose hands knew soil and ledger equally. They married when Clara was 19. In the early years, she learned to keep accounts, to dress the house for Sunday, to smile in a society that equated a woman's value to the peace of her parlor. Those first paragraphs of her life contained small triumphs. A stillborn calf saved by an improvised poultice, a neighbor lending seed in a bad loan, a child's first steps by the smokehouse. She also learned the rules that kept secrets sealed, a closed bedroom door, a hush about certain men, a polite refusal whenever questions edged toward private matters. Over the years, the plantation grew in acres and in complexity. James ascended from overseer to owner through thrift, marriage, and an eye for the market. Clara bore 2 children and kept the house with a disciplined hand. The world around Rose Hill praised James for his management and Clara for her charity. But beneath that praise lay patterns we now read as coercive. There were nights Clara refused his bed and woke with the taste of bitterness at the back of her throat. There were mornings she found tokens of strangers at the foot of her door. Her backstory is not simply a series of domestic accomplishments. It is a sequence of small resignations and a long accumulation of shame stitched together with duty. She learned to speak in ways that obscured pain, presentable sadness rather than outcry. When the will named her as an instrument of punishment, she felt the multiplication of decades of quiet into a public decree that would require her bodily submission in exchange for property arrangements. This is the story of a woman whose quiet had been mistaken for consent. James Whitmore's past is shorter on softness and longer on calculation. He had been the son of a marginal tenant and had built himself up from modest beginnings through a combination of frugality, force, and shrewd marriages. He knew the law enough to manipulate it, and the customs enough to exploit them. He loved the plantation as a ledger loves figures. He recorded debts and credits, named the names of people who would inherit, and believed that order required displays of authority. His relationship with Clara was complex. There were moments of tenderness. A letter he wrote on a fair morning when their firstborn was born. Small repairs he performed on the parlor chair with steady hands. But James also believed that the body of his wife was an extension of his household's honor, a symbol to be kept pristine and at times used as a tool of control. He had watched other planters assert dominance with fines and threats, with arranged marriages and public pillory. His will reveals a man who, at the end of life, sought to fix humiliation into paper. He feared the erosion of his name even as he feared the subversion of his household's hierarchy. In James's backstory, there is the grammar of possession. He treated property and persons as entries that could be amended, left, or withheld. That belief, decades in making, led to a clause that bound his private cruelties to public order. He died convinced that his final instrument would keep his reputation intact by imposing exemplars even in death. These 2 lives, one of quiet endurance and the other of systematic assertion, collided in a document that would force the county into a decision about the boundaries between private will and public law. There were other characters who would shape the outcome, each named and drawn into the legal net.
The attorney, Richard Mallory, measured and wary, argued procedure and precedent. Judge Samuel Beauregard, a man with a powdered wig and a temper kept in check by habit, would preside at the chancery hearing. Dr. Elias Monroe would be called to testify about Clara's physical condition. Sheriff Wallace Hargrove would be asked to enforce orders or refuse them. Reverend Amos Carter would be the public conscience declaiming in the press. Jennings the steward would hold ledgers and recall household patterns. Caleb Price, the black man present that day, would be asked to speak of what he knew of the men named in the will. Lydia Whitcomb, a neighbor and confidant, would provide testimony about family tensions. Sarah Benton, a domestic servant who had watched Clara through years of mournings, would be subpoenaed for character evidence. These 8 names would appear in petitions, in letters, and in the transcripts of a trial that would last for weeks. The community reaction was immediate. A letter to the Natchez Gazette, a whispered prayer meeting in the churchyard, Mrs. Langston at the general store folding her hands and refusing to speak James's name. The town found itself cataloging opinion and interest, not always kindly. Preparation for legal contestation followed the old routes. Richard Mallory filed a petition in the county chancery seeking a declaratory judgment as to the validity of the clause. He asked the court to declare whether a last will could compel a living person to submit to acts that amounted to sexual exploitation and whether such a stipulation violated public policy. The petition included copies of the will, affidavits from witnesses present at the reading, and a memorandum of law citing precedents from neighboring counties and a few relevant texts on wills and public policy. The petition also requested a temporary injunction to prevent the execution of any provision that would be illegal or that would cause bodily harm. In practical terms, the filing required precise steps. Mallory drew an affidavit from Clara, notarized statements from Jennings and Sarah Benton, and a certified copy of James Whitmore's certificate of death. A writ was drafted to notify heirs and named parties. Publication notices were printed in the Gazette as required by statute. The legal process required the clerk to enter the suit into the chancery docket, assign a hearing date, and notify the sheriff for service. The animal accounts and ledger entries were attached as exhibits to establish James's property holdings and the value of the estate. The language in the petition framed the dispute. It was not merely about a personal grievance, but about whether the law would countenance a testator dictating acts contrary to the public order. This technical work was quiet and meticulous, needing exact phrasing and attention to procedural perfection.
Deadlines more than rhetorical flourish. The trial that followed became the core of public scrutiny and the place where social codes met legal argument. Courtroom mornings had a particular smell: horse sweat from saddlebags, the dust of flourished papers, the stale tobacco that clung to men's coats. Reporter spools clicked in the gallery. The judge entered with his gavel, not loud but inevitable. The plaintiffs called witnesses in a slow choreography. The attorney for the estate argued first, reading the will into the record with an emphasis on testamentary freedom. He argued that the testator's wishes, even if harsh, were expressions of personal direction for property transfer. Mallory countered that testamentary freedom did not extend to commanding illegal acts or actions that would constitute assault or coercion. The exchanges that followed were long and exact. The estate's counsel asked Jennings, the steward, short, pointed questions. "Did Mr. Whitmore sign this page in your presence?" Jennings replied, "Yes, I was there the day he sealed it." "Did you see him in his right mind?" "He appeared as he always had, deliberate." The cross-examination by Mallory extended into the household's rhythms. "Did Mr. Whitmore ever speak of punishing his household publicly?" "He spoke often of deterrence to protect property." Mallory then called Clara to the stand. Her testimony was a study in restraint. In the witness box, she described nights of isolation, the small humiliations, and the pattern of threats. She spoke of the specific incident 3 years earlier when James forced her to host a dinner where his guests mocked her for being less correct in parade. She described the time a letter arrived naming a woman from a neighboring plantation, and how James laughed at the idea of scandal for his household, but then turned that idea into a tool to secure compliance. Her words were not lurid, they were arithmetic of hurt. The judge asked her if she had the capacity to refuse. She said yes and no. The court listened as she recounted the fear of social ostracism, the potential for children to be cast out, the financial reality that refusing might provoke a revision that stripped her of any home. The attorney representing the estate tried to paint her as compliant, suggesting that if she had been unwilling, she had long ago gone to her kin. Mallory asked pointed questions that revealed intervals of coercion. Did Mr. Whitmore ever threaten to dispossess you? He did say that without his favor, I would have nothing. That exchange set the framing the defense struggled to dismantle. The case included testimony from Dr. Elias Monroe, who was asked to describe Clara's state and whether forced intercourse could be proven medically. His testimony had to walk a line between forensic observation and moral opinion. He spoke of bruising, of signs of repeated stress, of sleeplessness, and of the physiological markers consistent with trauma. He emphasized he could not prove specific acts without contemporaneous medical
records, but he could testify to a pattern of harm. The defense then called 3 overseers who framed the household as orderly and insisted on the testator's clarity of mind in composing the will. Their recollections were precise but self-serving. At a key moment, the county sheriff testified about a rumor that James had sought to hire men from the neighboring plantation to carry out exemplary punishments. That testimony required Mallory to produce letters found in James's desk, written in a hurried hand, requesting volunteers among trusted workers to be present in certain nights. The letters did not specify the acts in clinical detail, but made enough allusion to intimidate. The reading of those letters in open court was a turning point. The gallery shifted, the whispers rose and sank like a tide. The defense sought to reframe those letters as references to discipline and morale rather than coercion. Mallory replied by demonstrating the context, a ledger entry that noted payment for services in a manner that suggested a different calculus. A dramatic moment occurred when Caleb Price was called. He had been an observer and sometimes a coerced laborer. The defense counsel attempted to discredit him, asking about his loyalty and implying bias. He answered simply and with pauses that spoke of weight long carried. I saw what the master did. I saw the men sent into the house, and I saw the way Mrs. Whitmore moved after those nights, he said. The cross-examination became heated. Are you saying you saw the acts? The counsel demanded. No, sir, Caleb answered. I am saying I saw a woman change. I am saying I heard orders given. His testimony was not forensic proof of acts in a criminal sense, but it gave the court a human measure of pattern and consequence. Procedural complexity crept in. The estate's counsel filed a motion to dismiss parts of the petition on grounds of testamentary intent and on the claim that the clause was merely hortatory and not an enforceable condition precedent. Mallory responded with a counter-motion for injunctive relief and for the court to issue a declaratory judgment. The Chancery Court had to consider whether to convert what was at its heart an internal family dispute into an enforceable legal question. The judge asked for briefs on public policy and for precedents about wills that commanded acts in personam. Legal scholars from the state university were cited. The court allowed a limited in-camera hearing to examine private letters. This technical maneuver had weight. It balanced the need for discovery and the protection of privacy. The judge's clerk recorded every minute. These procedural steps required explanation to an audience unfamiliar with Chancery practice. In plain language, the court was deciding whether a private instruction that would force a living person to submit to harm could be given effect when the law presumes liberty and public policy forbids contracts for wrongful acts. The tension between testamentary freedom and the protection of bodily integrity became the legal fulcrum on which the case turned. Tension rose on more than legal grounds.
News of the clause leaked, and the Gazette printed an editorial that split local opinion. Some readers argued that the plantation owner's last wishes, however unpalatable, were private and deserved respect. Others saw in the provision an extension of slavery's logic. If a man could command the bodies of his property, he might imagine he could command a wife's body as part of that hierarchy. Demonstrations were small but symbolic. Reverend Carter organized a prayer vigil where women braided white tissue into strips and tied them to the church gate in protest. At the market, people whispered and took sides. The Whitmore children, adolescents shaken, were pulled into rooms where elder cousins argued about loyalty and disgrace. Lydia Whitcomb wrote a letter to a sister in New Orleans describing the pall that fell over social cause. That letter was published and stoked wider interest. People who had once called on the Whitmores now hesitated. The social cost of the clause mounted. After 2 weeks of testimony, the judge convened a day for oral argument. Prominent lawyers spoke at length about the nature of consent and the sovereignty of the testator. Mallory emphasized public policy and a fundamental principle that the law protects bodily autonomy even against the last wishes of the dead. He argued that a clause that required a living woman to subject her body as a condition to inheritance was void against public policy, and that the court had the power to enjoin enforcement. The counsel for the estate argued that the will was ambiguous, that its language should be construed in favor of effectuating the testator's intent, and that there was no explicit demand for a crime. The judge retired to consider the briefs. When the ruling came, it landed like a measured hammer. Judge Samuel Beauregard read his opinion slowly, voice steady, each sentence deliberately paced. He declared that the clause was void to the extent it sought to compel acts that contravened public policy, and that the court would not enforce any testamentary provision that required bodily injury or sexual exploitation. He issued a declaratory judgment that the provision was unenforceable and entered a temporary injunction preventing any executor from attempting to carry the clause into practice. The legal language mattered. The judge did not simply condemn the moral content. He grounded the decision in established principles that contracts and wills could not require persons to perform acts illegal or against public policy. He cited a ratio of cases where courts refused to enforce bargains that required immoral acts. He also refused to award punitive damages or to strip the estate entirely, opting for a partial approach that balanced property rights with human dignity. The gallery exhaled in different ways. Reverend Carter crossed himself in visible relief. Thomas Whitmore paced like a caged animal. Clara sat with her hands in her lap, each finger a small island. Immediate consequences followed. The injunction meant the provision could not be executed. The executor, who had anticipated a clear path to asset distribution, found himself constrained. He proposed an alternative distribution plan that allotted the tangible property to named heirs while instituting a fund for the care of the Whitmore children. That plan was accepted provisionally by the court and subject to appeal. The decision generated a flurry of letters to the press. Some lauded the court for upholding human dignity. Others complained that the judge had overstepped and interfered with property rights. In the community, the ruling polarized relationships. The Whitmore brothers argued bitterly about whether to appeal. The Stewart Jennings tried to reconcile the workforce by promising steadier wages and more consistent rations. Yet, mistrust had seeded itself into the fields. Some enslaved men named in the will found their status momentarily altered. There were whispers that some would petition for manumission or for better treatment. The practical aspect of dividing the estate required appraisers, promissory notes, and a re-examination of titles. Appraisers came to measure cotton houses and barns, to place values on livestock and on the small town houses that lined Market Street. The financial machinery that had run quietly now clattered as lawyers made claims and accountants shifted numbers. The social fallout extended beyond simple accounting. Households that had once kept close relations now kept distance. Lydia Whitcomb refused calls from the family. Sarah Benton, who had been subpoenaed, found herself unemployed and walked in the street with her head covered. Caleb Price, having testified, faced a precarious future. Men of color who entered public spaces as witnesses risked retribution or ostracism, and yet some found in their statements a spark of agency. The county ordered that any acts of intimidation against witnesses would be prosecuted. This led to a publicly announced policy change. The sheriff's office would more actively protect witnesses in sensitive civil matters. In practical technical terms, the sheriff filed new procedures for witness protection that included sworn statements of threats, reassignment of patrols during critical testimony, and a requirement that the clerk notify the public of scheduled sessions where contentious materials would be read. That procedural modification, though small, signaled a local recognition that public involvement in private matters required a degree of civic protection. 1 month after the ruling, the plantation scene had shifted in visible ways. The Rose Hill porch, once a stage for polished hospitality, now collected notices of stock sales and creditor filings. Clara had taken up residence with a sister in Natchez for safety and reflection. She received letters from women in neighboring towns offering bread and small comforts. The Whitmore children attended a tutor whose stipend was arranged by sympathetic kin. Caleb Price had been briefly sponsored for a petition to manumit one of his younger relatives, a process that remained fraught but had gained momentum in conversation. The community was unsettled. Some families barred their doors and some gatherings dissolved into private grief. The first month was raw and marked by practical shuffles of survival and precaution. 3 months later, the dust of headlines had settled into chronic unease. The appeals process moved slowly, and the estate's council filed notice of appeal to the state Supreme Court. Meanwhile, a group of local women who had once kept silent in parlors formed a discreet lyceum to discuss legal reforms and the protection of married women's rights in the state. They petitioned local legislators and drafted a memorandum urging clearer limits on testamentary provisions and stronger protections for bodily autonomy. Their work was cautious and strategic, composed of letters, petition drives, and quiet lobbying. Clara, having found a measure of support, testified before a small legislative hearing about the human cost of private cruelties made law. Her words there were spare and effective. The social conversation, while not yet transformed into law, had moved from rumor to policy talk. 6 months after the ruling, the case had left permanent marks. The Chancery decision stood, though the appeal lingered. Rose Hill had been sold in part to satisfy debts and to reorganize management. Some of the enslaved men named in the will had been redistributed as part of estate settlements. A handful of them successfully petitioned sympathetic owners for better work terms. One man, Daniel, found a sponsor who trained him for skilled carpentry and eventually arranged a limited path that would lead to purchased freedom. Clara's life had shifted. She lived modestly but with purpose, founding a small school for girls on the edge of Natchez and focusing on education as a means to unsettle the structural conditions that produce silent suffering. The Whitmore name in the county split into those who defended the family's honor and those who saw the end of James's legacy as a cautionary tale. The broader legal impact was modest but significant. The case was cited in later chancery suits as a precedent for refusing to enforce testamentary clauses that demanded personal acts. Newspapers in other counties reprinted accounts, and legal treatises referenced Judge Beauregard's opinion as an example of balancing testamentary freedom against public policy. At the end, the matter offered a stark moral question. Can a law that protects property rights also be the instrument of private cruelty? And if so, how do communities and courts disentangle ownership from human dignity? The case showed that a legal system could intervene to prevent the enforcement of a will that commanded harm, yet it also showed the limits of law in repairing what had already been endured. For the individuals most directly affected, the costs were not entirely redressed. Clara's dignity was affirmed by court pronouncement and by the support of neighbors, but the years of quiet humiliation could not be fully measured or returned. The enslaved men named in the instrument suffered through a reshuffling of bondage and occasionally found small openings toward skilled labor or sympathetic guardians, yet many losses were irreversible. If you are moved by this story, pause for a moment with us. We know that accounts of private cruelty made public stir many feelings: anger, sorrow, disbelief. It is natural to want to take a clear side in defense of human dignity. Tell us in the comments what you would do if you were inside that parlor the day the will was read. Start your comment with "I would fight" or "I would yield," and then explain in a sentence or two why. Your answers will help shape our next episodes, where we examine the legal and moral frameworks that might prevent such harm. We are building a community that does not only consume stories, but asks how institutions and neighbors can act to protect the vulnerable. After you comment, we will return to the moment in court where a key letter changed the tenor of testimony, and to the private papers that revealed motives behind a public cruelty. The legacy of Rose Hill carried a vocabulary of law and conscience that would be invoked for decades. Words like testament and manumission and property and guardianship would be repeated in local papers and legal briefs. Lawyers spoke of contestation and appeal, of chancery principle, and of the sentence that a judge could pronounce when confronted with the boundaries of testimony and cruelty. Historians later would call the case emblematic of the way slavery's logic of ownership could contaminate domestic life. The recordings and transcripts preserved in the county archive show how a document signed by a man in his study could become a public scandal that required courts to enforce limits. These records include the will itself, letters kept in James' desk, the transcript of Clara's testimony, and the judge's opinion. They are technical items and human artifacts at once. In the months and years that followed Rose Hill's episode, the community learned small lessons about the reach of law and the resilience of human dignity. The Chancery ruling did not make all things right. It did not reverse the social ostracism overnight, nor did it erase the patterns of ownership that made such cruelty conceivable. But it created a public statement that the law would not be a passive repository for instructions that violated fundamental personal liberty. It created a small procedural legacy in the sheriff's handling of witnesses and in the county clerk's approach to sensitive files. It inspired a local women's circle that pushed slowly at statutory reforms. Above all, it left a moral question that remains relevant. When private wishes cross the line into public harm, who is responsible to intervene and by what instruments? If this story unsettled you and you want to learn more about similar cases and the legal doctrines at play, subscribe to the channel. We dig into original documents, consult with historians and legal scholars, and bring context to stories that shape how communities understand justice and humanity. Leave your thoughts below and let us know which detail you would investigate next. The paper that began as a private will become, for a time, a public trial of conscience. What it teaches us is that law can restrain some harms, but community and memory must do the rest.